Okay, now let's look at ways that we as educators can work to reduce bias and increase fairness in our assessment practices. Current research in education dealing with bias is actually tied to this classroom assessment fairness. And when we think about classroom assessment fairness, there are at least 4 components that pop up right now in the most current research, and these are rather teaching elements, learning elements, classroom interactions, and assessment. So when we talk about promoting fairness in our classroom assessment, we need to pay specific attention to potential bias in our teaching, the way that kids are able to learn, as well as classroom interactions and assessment. And you can investigate either one of these elements by looking at its subcomponents and see that some of these subcomponents appear in more than one place, such as sex bias, distributive justice. Those both pop up, both in the way that we interact with students in the classroom as well as in our teaching practices. Now we need to start with what we mean by assessment bias. And assessment bias means or refers to qualities of an instrument or assessment tools that unfairly penalize a group of students because of that student's gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, or any other group defining characteristics. One type of assessment bias is what we call offensiveness. So an assessment is biased if any of the content itself is deemed offensive to a group or subgroup of students. Offensiveness is when there are negative stereotypes of subgroups that are presented in the test. So types of offensiveness could include slurs based on negative stereotypes about how members of an ethnic group or religious group act, or in this case, let's take a look at this example. Suppose that in most test items in an exam, men are shown in high-paying, respectful careers, and women are portrayed in low-paying jobs. Many women and other individuals as well would logically be offended by this and might perform less well than they normally would behave or would have because of the offensiveness of the content. Another type of assessment bias is what we call unfair penalization, and that arises when a student's test performance is distorted because even though the content isn't offensive, it does disadvantage a student because of that student's group membership. So it's really important to understand that unfair penalization occurs when it's not the student's ability that causes a low performance, but rather the student's group membership. And for example, let's take a look at this part of an assessment piece. It says, Linda had 3 tamales and 2 tacos before noon. This would be almost impossible for an Arabic-speaking English language learner who just arrived in the United States to figure out what are the meaning of these new words, tamales and tacos. So if we change 2 minor changes, we can make it much more clear what tamales and tacos refer to. They refer to food. We could put Linda ate 3 tamales and 2 tacos for lunch. A little different than what's up here. These words ate and lunch make it really much more accessible to English language learners and help them to be able to decipher that these 2 terms, tamales and tacos, refer to food items. This statement, however, results in what we call unfair penalization, in this case to English language learners. So it's not about their ability to answer the question as much as it is about their inability to decipher the English language at this point. Another example would be this problem. Oscar bought a new sweater that cost $200. He paid for the sweater with a credit card with simple interest at a rate of etc., etc. His first payment of $50 was late. What would be the balance on his next monthly statement? So this problem would be challenging to even students born and raised in the United States. So consider how much harder it would be for an English language learner who grew up in a place such as Belarus, small Eastern European country where cash is the only negotiable currency. We could make this problem more accessible by providing an explanation of what do we mean by late charges and interest. So our test items as well as our curriculum can be modified to ensure that our English language learners understand not only the content, but as well as the underlying concepts that are involved in what we're working on. So up to this point, we've been talking mostly about assessment practices and how to reduce bias, but we also need to look at the learners themselves. And it's important to keep in mind that students' fairness-related beliefs vary. By that I mean that individual students, yourself and myself included, we would interpret fairness different based on our background, our experiences, our worldview. So these differences in students' perception about what fair really is often are related to gender, to culture. But one thing that students have in common is overall students do want transparency, primarily because this gives all of our students a greater opportunity to learn and to demonstrate their learning. So our tip for teachers is this. Our students appreciate transparency, specifically in relation to the provision of study guides, explicit expectations, grading criteria, unambiguous test items, and clear feedback. So kids want to know exactly where we're headed, how they're going to be measured, what's expected of them, and they want to have clear feedback. And yes, students do tend to prefer equal treatment in grading, but students recognize that for students with learning disabilities, exceptions do need to be made. So our teacher tip is to make sure that as often as we can, let's make sure that we have criterion referenced assessment, because that's what our students often consider the most fair. And in this case, criterion reference assessment means assessment that has clearly established and clearly discussed and presented criteria, so kids know what's expected of them and how they'll be evaluated. Another way that we can look at fairness in assessment is by really examining our practices before, during, and after assessment administration, and ask ourselves, does the way that we go about assessment, does it make it so different students have the same access? They're as likely to succeed as their peers, or are we creating and promoting disequity in how we go about assessment? So we need to make sure that we're striving to provide equal access and opportunity for learning and assessment, making sure that we're granting the same learning opportunities for each student and not giving preferential treatment to a certain group or type of individual in our class, as well as allowing them the same opportunities to prepare. For example, is it only our students that can afford high-speed internet that have access to our study preparation materials? As well as we need to make sure that we're accommodating based on our students' individual abilities and linguistic backgrounds, not just students who are identified as legally needing accommodations and modifications, such as special education students, but all students who are struggling based on their ability and linguistic background. So other tips for teachers for increasing equity in assessment include this. We want to make sure that we're providing equal access to all students for learning and assessment. That includes multiple and varied opportunities to learn. Are we presenting it different ways that different students can find it accessible, and also providing them different ways to demonstrate their learning? We always want to make sure that we're providing equitable and differentiated learning opportunities based on their varied learning opportunities, their needs, and providing accommodations based on their ability and linguistic background, and that we're working as well to reduce and eliminate disparities in learning opportunities by providing access to quality resources, including are all students having access to competent teachers, proper facilities, quality materials that are accessible and decipherable by them, as well as access to content material before an assessment. Can they be and feel prepared regardless of their background, socioeconomic status, etc.? It's also important that we're providing equity in assessment through accommodations, making sure that we're providing accommodations for exceptional learners, English language learners as well, and as often as possible making sure that whatever modifications or accommodations we provide on assessments, we're allowing students to pursue the same objective as the original assessment. One thing that can be a challenge but is absolutely necessary is to make sure that the language of the assessment is congruent with the language of instruction, that our students who are still acquiring language or English as a language aren't cut out of the ability to perform based on their ability, cultural background, etc. And it's also important to keep in mind that modified assessments should not simplify the cognitive and critical thinking load. We should have high expectations for our students, but make sure that those assessment materials, the assessment questions themselves, are accessible to our kiddos. And as needed, we should provide our English language learners hints to help them complete their task. When it comes to accommodations, we need to avoid the temptation to automatically provide our English language learners and our special education students the same accommodations. So all my SPED kids, all my ELLs, they're all going to go about it this way. It's wrong to group such a diverse group of individuals into the same group and say all my ELLs or all my SPED kids. They are individual learners, and we should approach them as such as we seek to accommodate their needs. In addition, other teacher tips for increasing equity include providing clear and consistent grading criteria, making sure that we communicate to our students exactly how they'll be evaluated, what good quality work looks like, that before and after assessments, as we're starting to give feedback, we're giving clear justification and explanation of how the criteria is being used. Our feedback needs to be effective, constructive, and descriptive in order to be helpful to our students. We also need to do our best to avoid score pollution or evaluating any student's performance based on factors that are not related to their performance. Misbehavior, gender, effort, progress, our compassion for them, their difficulty working in groups. When we start to score kids down or up based on other factors, that's what we call score pollution. And we want it to be very, very clear to students, both the criteria and our feedback, and not be polluted by other things that we might value or impose upon or allow to infiltrate our scoring. So let's switch gears just a little bit with this question. I want you to look at this picture and decide what one noun would you use to describe this picture. Go ahead and hit pause here, and when you've got one noun, go ahead and hit play. Now in this case, this is an actual assessment item that was administered on the Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT, and the correct answer was actually an analogy that used the word regatta. And so regatta is a term that in this case few African American students knew, while many more Caucasian counterparts were familiar with the word. And this leads into what we're talking about, which is cultural bias in assessment. And we need to worry about both cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our students and make sure that we are not using materials that don't represent the cultural and linguistic backgrounds of our students. So for example, here's a question that was used in the study. If you had to sort the objects below into one of the categories, which category would you put them into? Now, how about this? What if you had to put them into two categories? Each of these items, what two categories would you put each of them into? Now, in this case, what happened was Western students, think of those born and raised in the United States, and Liberian students were asked to sort 20 objects that were divided evenly into these linguistic categories: foods, implements, food containers, clothing. Now, Westerners tended to sort these objects into the groups for food and implements, while Liberian participants would actually routinely pair something, for example, the potato and the knife, pair a potato with a knife because they reasoned the knife was used to cut the potato. In other words, our backgrounds influence how we sort, how we categorize. And this was interesting because when questioned, the Liberian participants said that their pairing of these two together, they said a wise person would do items the same way. And then when the researchers asked the Liberian students, to show what an unwise person would do, they actually did exactly what the Westerners did, which was to separate these two items, the potato into food, and then the knife into the implements. In other words, our culture can actually bias into determining what we think is right, justifying that, and interpreting somebody else's answer as incorrect. Cultural bias in assessment is also manifested when the assessments are written in a language that's not the native language of the student, of the test taker. So we need to make sure we're considering a non-native English speaker's language proficiency. For example, Latino students might appear to be very proficient in English as they interact with their peers, but nonetheless be more proficient in Spanish than English when it comes to academic language. So if the assessment is administered in English and is timed, they're not only working to perform in the assessment, they're working to decipher the language as well, more so than if the test is in English and untimed. And of course, we need to be very cautious about potential sexual bias or sex bias in the quality of teacher-student interactions. Overall, we need to ask ourselves questions such as, do females tend to interact with males more than females? And female mathematics and language teachers tend to interact more with males. This has been replicated again and again in research. Is classroom discussion and questioning affected by our sex-biased behavior? Are we allowing our male students to talk over our female students? Do male and female students receive the same or different grades for identical performance on the assessment tasks, despite our best efforts? Do male students outperform our female students in terms of decontextualized multiple choice items, where females outperform boys with contextualized qualitative questions? Again, these are all examples of bias that are repeatedly manifest in classrooms around the country. Finally, we need to, in our pursuits of classroom assessment fairness, pay close attention to how we teach, how our students learn, how we interact with our students, as well as the instruments, the assessments that we use to gauge students' learning.